If you look at an English dictionary, the letters Q and U are, well, they're basically treated like a law of physics.
Oh, absolutely. They are completely inseparable in our minds.
Right. I mean, you learn it in elementary school right alongside I before E, except after C. It's just presented to you as this absolute comforting law of nature that you can always rely on.
Yeah, a foundational rule of the language.
Exactly. But, and this is why we're doing this deep dive today, buried in that very same dictionary are words that just completely shatter this rule.
Oh, they do, completely.
And looking at our source material for today, it reveals this hidden history of lazy census workers and French hat makers and even Arctic explorers.
It's a wildly diverse list of culprits, honestly.
It really is. So our mission today is to unpack this source article, which details the history of this spelling convention, along with 15 fascinating English words that end in the letter Q with absolutely no U in sight.
Not a single one.
Right. We're going to figure out why this rule exists in the first place, and more importantly, how and why we break it. Because as it turns out, we have to look at the origin of the Q rule first, since it wasn't even native to the English language to begin with.
No, it wasn't. English actually inherited that specific Q-U pairing from French and Latin.
Wait, really? So what were we doing before that?
Well, before that foreign influence arrived, we had Old English. And in Old English, the sound that we now associate with Q was spelled entirely differently. It was represented by a C and a W.
C and a W.
Yep.
CW.
That looks incredibly strange to the modern eye. It almost looks like a typo.
It does. To see how this played out historically, the source actually provides a few specific examples that illustrate the shift perfectly. Take the modern word queen, for instance.
Okay.
In Old English, that was spelled C-W-E-N, quen.
Quen. Wow, so the pronunciation is, what, nearly identical to what we say today?
Basically, yeah. But the spelling just belongs to a completely different orthographic universe.
That is wild. Right. And we see the exact same pattern with the word quell, meaning to subdue or silence something. That used to be quellen. C-W-E-L-L-N.
Oh, man.
And the word quick, which in Old English was quick. C-W-I-C.
So what happened? Who killed all the CW words?
The Norman conquest happened.
Ah, of course.
Yeah, so scribes who were trained in France arrived in England, and they looked at this native Old English spelling ecosystem, and they just found it, well, unfamiliar and clunky.
Right, it didn't look like their French and Latin texts.
Exactly. So they started replacing those native key W spellings with the Q convention that they were already comfortable with.
It's essentially the linguistic version of an invasive species.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Yeah, think about something like kudzu vines being introduced to a brand new environment. You have this native Old English spelling ecosystem just happily humming along with its little key W words. And then across the channel comes the shiny new Latin and French Q convention. It gets planted in the language and it just aggressively spreads. It crowds out the native QW spellings until they are completely extinct.
Yeah, the invasive species completely colonized the dictionary. We've been rolling out these Q spellings like a linguistic blanket across the language ever since.
Language is never really static.
Never. As much as those early scribes tried to impose this strict, supposedly unbreakable rule, resistance always bubbles up.
Always.
And what the source material shows us is that before we even look at how foreign influence breaks the Q rule today, English speakers actually rebel against it from the inside.
Homegrown rebellion. I love it. We are just rule breakers by nature, I think, especially when it comes to, the creation of slang and abbreviations that kind of take on a life of their own.
Pure utility and human laziness. They are incredibly powerful drivers of language evolution.
So true. And a perfect example from the source is PDQ, as in, I need this report on my desk, PDQ.
Right, which is an abbreviation for pretty damned quick, meaning obviously immediately or as soon as possible.
Yeah.
But what really stands out about PDQ is its endurance. I mean, this isn't some modern internet slang born from text messaging.
Right, it feels like it should be, but it's not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It actually dates all the way back to the late 19th century. It's likely tied to the need for brevity in telegraph communications. And it is hung around the lexicon long enough to essentially function as its own independent word now.
We also see clinical jargon getting this exact same treatment. The source highlights the word trank, ending in that solitary Q.
Oh, yeah, trank.
It's an abbreviation for tranquilizer, and it's also used as a byname for the sedative xylazine. And, I mean, it totally makes sense that medical professionals, or really just people in everyday speech, would want to clip a bulky four-syllable word down to just one.
Absolutely. Efficiency always wins.
But, okay, the most fascinating homegrown rule breaker from the source, hands down, has to be POSLQ. P-O-S-L-Q.
Pronounced possil.
Yeah, POSLQ. I am looking at the origin of this, and I gotta say, it feels like purely bureaucratic alphabet soup.
It really is. It stands for person of the opposite sex sharing living quarters.
Which is just, it's so clunky. It came from the world of demographics and the census.
They did, yeah. And the context here is super key. Think about the societal shifts that were happening a few decades ago. Demographics were changing, and unmarried couples living together were becoming increasingly common.
Right, the traditional categories weren't cutting it anymore.
Exactly. The Census Bureau needed a way to categorize this specific demographic, but the English language actually lacked a purely neutral term for it.
Oh, interesting. Because words like boyfriend or girlfriend or partner, they carry all this specific romantic or social weight.
Exactly. The bureaucracy needed something totally sterile and exact. So they invented this incredibly clunky phrase, person of the opposite sex sharing living quarters, and then they just shortened it to an acronym.
But, okay, I have to jump in here. Just because some census worker got tired of writing out a long phrase and created an acronym, does that really mean it deserves a spot in the dictionary? I have to push back a little on treating POSLQ as a real word.
That's a fair point, but...
And I mean, the source notes it is now spelled in lowercase, much like radar or sonar. But, you know, radar and sonar describe physical, tangible technologies. Does POSLQ really cross that threshold into being a legitimate part of the English language?
Well, this actually touches on one of the most fundamental debates in linguistics, the battle between prescriptivism and descriptivism.
Okay, lay that out for me.
So prescriptivism basically views language as a museum. It's a set of rigid rules that must be protected from corruption.
Right, keep everything in its glass case.
Exactly. Descriptivism, on the other hand, views language as a tool belt. If a tool works, it stays. The reality is that a word earns its status simply through utility and usage. Think about radar again. It started as an acronym for radio detection and ranging. But over time, the capital letters erode because people just stop thinking of it as an acronym. They start treating it as a standard noun.
And so POSLQ just went through that same erosion.
Exactly. It filled a semantic gap. If enough people understand the concept when you say POSLQ, the acronym sheds its capital letters and it just becomes part of the furniture.
It really is a profound shift when you think about it. Going from this sterile, capitalized census acronym to a lowercase word with its own unique pronunciation.
It's language in motion.
But, you know, while we are out here casually clipping acronyms in the modern era, the real irony for me is looking back at the original architects of our spelling rules.
The French.
Yes. French is the very language that invaded Old English and forced the whole Q rule on us in the first place. Yet the source highlights a pair of words from French that completely break their own rule by ending in just a single Q.
It is incredibly ironic. The first one the source mentions is cinq, spelled C-I-N-Q. Now, in native French, this is simply the number 5.
Right. But when we pulled it into English, we didn't use it to, like, count apples or ask how old a kindergartner is.
No, we didn't.
We adopted cinq, which, by the way, sometimes also spelled C-I-N-Q-U-E. But we adopted it specifically in the context of card games and dice-throwing games.
Yeah, it became a highly specialized gaming term. And the second word follows a very similar pattern, coq, C-O-Q.
Like coq au vin.
Exactly. In native French, it literally just means a rooster. But when English borrowed it, the definition shifted entirely. In English, coq evolved to mean a very specific adornment of cockerel feathers used in a woman's hat.
That is just such an oddly specific and, like, niche adoption. We borrow the word for a literal farm animal, a rooster, but we only use it to describe the feathers on high society fashion.
This is actually the mechanism of semantic narrowing at work.
Semantic narrowing.
Yeah. When a language imports a loan word, it rarely imports the entire broad meaning of that word. English didn't need another generic word for a farm bird.
Right. We already had a pretty robust vocabulary for that. We had rooster, cockerel, chicken.
Exactly. But high society did need a specific chic-sounding word to describe this new elite hat fashion. So the meaning of the borrowed word narrows down drastically to fill just that one specific luxurious niche.
Oh, I get it. It's like, okay, it's like going to the hardware store and buying this massive, incredibly expensive multi-tool that has, like, 50 different gadgets. You know, it's got a saw, pliers, wire cutters, the works.
We know exactly the kind you mean.
Right. But you bring it home and you only ever use the tiny, flimsy little pair of scissors to open your mail.
That is exactly it.
You bought the whole tool, but you only use one tiny, highly specific function.
And building on that multi-tool analogy, it really highlights how borrowing words is rarely about replacing the tools we already have. It's about adding highly specialized implements to our vocabulary.
Right. French provided the specialized vocabulary for elite games and fashion.
But if we want to see what drives the most rule-breaking cue words in English, we have to look way beyond elite microcultures. We have to look at the macro scale of globalization and Mediterranean trade.
Right. The source points out that as these global trade routes opened up, English had to absorb words from Arabic and other Semitic languages. And this introduced a massive phonetic problem for English scholars.
A huge problem. Because they encountered a sound represented by the Semitic letter qaf.
Which we just didn't have.
No, we didn't. The phonetic challenge here is transliteration, the process of mapping the sounds of one alphabet onto another. And the English alphabet was simply not designed to accommodate the sounds of Arabic.
So what exactly is the sound of the qaf?
It represents a voiceless uvular stop.
Okay, English translation, please.
Right, so unlike the English K sound, which is made at the roof of the mouth, the qaf is pronounced much further back in the throat, down at the uvula. English speakers literally did not have the linguistic hardware or the letters to accurately capture it.
Ah, okay. So scholars essentially adopted a convention. They decided to use the English letter Q entirely on its own to act as a stand-in for the qaf.
Exactly. That's why we see words like the country Qatar, spelled with a Q and no U.
Which makes total sense now. And the source gives us this really fascinating list of words that came to us through these trade routes. And looking at them, they are heavily focused on the physical infrastructure of commerce.
They're very practical words.
Yeah, like there is funduk, spelled F-U-N-D-U-Q, and sambuk, S-A-M-B-U-Q.
Right. So a funduk is an inn or a lodging house that also doubles as a storehouse or warehouse, primarily found in Mediterranean and Red Sea countries.
Okay.
And a sambuk is a type of Arabian sailing boat.
You know, I'm looking at funduk and sambuk here, and it strikes me that these aren't just casual slang like PDQ.
No, not at all.
These are highly specific maritime and commercial terms. It really makes me wonder why English traders didn't just call a funduk a warehouse or call a sambuk a sailboat. Like, why go through the effort to bring the actual foreign word back into the English dictionary?
That's a great question. And it's because a warehouse in London and a funduk in the Red Sea operated totally differently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a funduk was a specific socioeconomic institution. It was a place where merchants lived, stored goods, and traded, and it was often regulated by local authorities in a way that English warehouses just were not.
Ah, so there's cultural baggage attached to the word.
Exactly. If an English merchant simply wrote warehouse in their ledger or dispatch, they would be losing crucial contextual information. And the same applies to the sambuk. It has a distinct hull shape and specific rigging. So the specific word preserves the specific utility.
That makes a lot of sense. And that need for preservation seems to become even more intense when we look at the words tied to culture, law, and religion in the source.
Oh, absolutely.
The source lists nastaliq, borrowed from Persian, which is a sloping Arabic script associated with poetic writings. And then there's TALAQ, which is a term from Islamic law for a form of divorce where the husband officially rejects his wife using the word talaq itself.
And there is also zindiq, which refers to a religious heretic or infidel in Islam. When you are dealing with legal frameworks and religious categories, precision is everything.
Because the legal gravity of a word like talaq is immense, right? You can't just casually translate that to divorce because the word itself is the actual legal mechanism.
Precisely. If you mistranslate or dilute that word in a legal or historical document, you completely destroy its weight.
So that is the crux of why these standalone cue words entered the lexicon.
Exactly. English speakers were absorbing entirely new cultural concepts. To translate a word like zindiq simply as heretic strips away all the specific theological context of early Islamic history. Scholars use the standalone cue to signal that these concepts required respect for their original linguistic and cultural boundaries.
That is fascinating. And there is one more word from this region that I think just perfectly embodies this entire era of exploration. Rafiq, R-A-F-I-Q.
Well,
Brought to English via 18th and 19th century travelogues.
A Rafiq was a traveling companion in Arabian countries who worked as both a guide and a translator.
And, reading about the Rafiq in the source, it becomes super clear this wasn't just like a casual tour guide showing you the sights.
No, not at all. In the 18th century, traveling through these regions as an outsider was incredibly dangerous.
Right. So the Rafiq was essentially a human bridge between worlds. They were probably the only reason English explorers survived to write those travelogues and bring these words back in the first place.
The word itself carries the weight of that survival and cross-cultural navigation.
Which is such a perfect metaphor. I mean, I have to point out, the Rafiq, the guide and translator, is exactly what we were trying to do for you right now on this deep dive. We're translating this dense linguistic landscape into something easily navigable.
I love that. And the necessity of navigating unfamiliar and often dangerous territory is actually the perfect transition to our final category of rule-breaking cue words.
The extremes of geography.
Right. Because if the Mediterranean trade routes brought us all those complex Middle Eastern words, it was explorers venturing into the harsh, freezing extremes of the Arctic, alongside scholars studying the deep traditions of Jewish communities, that brought us this final batch.
Yeah, the source highlights several words of Inuit origin here. First, there's umiak, U-M-I-A-Q, which is a kind of sealskin canoe. Then there's qualik, which starts A-N-D, ends with a Q, which is wild.
Q-U-L-L-I-Q.
That's an Inuit soakstone oil lamp.
And the source also lists a psychological term, right?
Yes, Pibloktok, P-I-B-L-O-K-T-O-Q, described as a hysteria-like condition observed among the Inuit.
So, from the physical extremes of the Arctic, we shift to the extremes of spirit and faith. The source gives us a word with Hebrew origins too. Tzaddik, T-Z-A-D-I-Q.
A tzaddik is a term used for the leader of a Hasidic Jewish community, or sometimes more loosely, just a particularly righteous individual.
Now, looking at these Arctic and Hebrew words together, there is a really glaring pattern in the source material that caught my eye.
For almost all of these, the source explicitly lists variant spellings, like uniak can be spelled umiak with a K at the end. Qualik is an alternative for kudlik, with KS. Tzaddik has multiple variations. It seems like the dictionary just can't actually make up its mind on how to spell these.
And that's because those variant spellings document the messy, real-time struggle of transliteration that we discussed earlier.
Right.
Inuit languages and Hebrew, much like Arabic, have phonetic sounds that English simply does not possess naturally. When explorers or scholars heard the word for a soapstone lamp out in the freezing cold, they had to invent a way to write it down on the fly.
Which sounds incredibly difficult.
It is. Some used a K, some used a C, some used a CK, and eventually some settled on the Q.
It's like, I don't know, it's like trying to play a complex jazz solo on a piano that's missing half its keys. The sounds of the spoken language just don't map perfectly one-to-one onto the English keyboard, so you are forcing the closest approximation.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
But that leads me to a really foundational question here. Why did scholars decide to use the letter Q at all for these approximations?
What do you mean?
Well, if you are trying to write down the word for a soapstone lamp, why use a Q at the end of qualik instead of just a K, which English speakers already intuitively understand? What is it about the letter Q that makes scholars designate it as the dumping ground for sounds that don't fit the English mold?
That is a great observation. To answer that, you have to consider the visual psychology of the English alphabet. Q is the odd one out. It is rare, and because it has been so rigidly tied to the letter U in our minds for centuries, seeing a Q on its own immediately disrupts our reading rhythm.
It makes you stumble.
Exactly. It signals to the reader, pay attention, this word is from somewhere else.
Oh, yeah. It is literally a visual flag planted right in the middle of a sentence.
Yes. If you spell Zadik with a K at the end, the reader might just gloss over it, assuming it's just a quirky native English word. But the standalone Q preserves the otherness of the word.
It creates a necessary friction.
It does. The Q acts as a visual placeholder for the foreign, the ancient, or the untranslatable, ensuring the reader knows they are engaging with a concept completely outside their native framework.
That is incredible. Let's take a step back and just look at the massive journey mapped out in this single source today. We started in the murky past with Old English, where words like queen and quick were perfectly happy being spelled with a C and a W.
The good old days of Quen.
Right. But then the Norman conquest violently imposed the Q rule upon us, and it became the absolute law of the land. But then, almost immediately, we watched as that unbreakable rule was systematically dismantled from every possible angle.
Bureaucrats and efficiency gave us postula and PDQ. The very French who gave us the rule broke it with sink and coke through the semantic narrowing of high society fashion and games.
And then global trade routes and the phonetic limitations of the English alphabet forced us to adopt the Semitic quf, giving us words like TALAQ and funduk.
And finally, explorers pushing to the edges of the map in the Arctic and scholars studying ancient texts used the standalone Q to capture sounds that English just wasn't designed to make.
The overarching narrative here is that spelling rules are never as rigid as they appear to be in elementary school.
Never.
And this is exactly why this matters to you, listening to this deep dive right now. Spelling rules aren't laws of physics. They aren't arbitrary torture devices meant to make you fail a spelling test. They are living, breathing maps of human interaction.
But it's so true. Every time you see an exception to the rule, you are looking at a collision of cultures.
Exactly. Knowing a word like trank or umiak isn't just about dominating your next game of Scrabble, though, it will definitely help. It's about seeing the fingerprints of global history, of trade, of bureaucratic laziness, and Arctic exploration right there on the keyboard in front of you.
Every single word holds a lineage. And the exceptions to the rules, the words that just refuse to comply, they often hold the most fascinating lineages of all.
Which leaves us with one final provocative puzzle for you to mull over. We've seen today how much the English language has morphed over the centuries. If Old English could transform so radically that Quen became queen, and if sterile demographic categories could birth a brand new lowercase word like posselhu just through sheer societal need, well, seemingly unbreakable grammar or spelling rule that we strictly enforce today is destined to be completely dismantled by the internet and global culture in the next 100 years.
It's a great question.
When the history books are written about our current era, what elementary school rule will we be remembered for finally breaking? Until next time.